The Soviet Air Force has its roots in Tsarist times. When World War I began in 1914, the Russian aviation industry was very lackluster compared to the other great powers, such as Germany, France, and Britain. Russia heavily relied upon foreign imports of aircraft, mostly from France. But when France refused to export large quantities of aircraft to Russia due to their own needs on the Western Front, Russia was forced to develop a domestic aviation industry. The initiation of the Russian aviation industry during World War I would eventually allow the Soviet government to expand the Air Force. The successful Bolshevik Revolution occurred on November 7, 1917. Naturally, the situation in Russia was very chaotic at this time. The Central Powers, taking advantage of the revolt, pushed deeper into Russia as exhausted Russian troops deserted or fought without proper coordination. In addition, anti-Soviet forces, known as the White Armies, were organizing in southern and eastern Russia. A day later, the All-Russian Congress of Soviets of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies was formed by the Bolsheviks with the objective of managing inherited military equipment from the old government. The Bolsheviks immediately began organizing a proper air force and trained pilots. They established the Soviet Air Force in 1918. In the same year, 2 commissions were set up to unify all air detachments in Russia and to direct the combat missions of the Red Air Force units. Still, at this time, the Soviets invested more resources into the Army and Navy compared to the Air Force. More Army troops were needed to fill the gaps in the vast front line. Compared to the United States, Germany, Britain, and France, who had aircraft numbers in the thousands, the Bolsheviks had a very insignificant number of planes. By 1919, the Bolsheviks had garnered an inventory of roughly 350 combat aircraft of various models. On the other hand, the White forces were unable to seize many aircraft from the Imperial Russian military. Most Bolshevik planes were made for reconnaissance or training roles. They had very few fighters, and the ones available to them were obsolete. One bright spot that does stand out was the inventory of many bombers. Russia had been a leader in heavy bomber technology during World War I and had manufactured around 85 heavy bombers. Some were captured by Ukrainian, Polish, and White Russian forces, but a handful were used by the Soviets. A total of 500 kilograms of bombs could be carried. The main issue plaguing the Soviet air industry at this time was a lack of standardization. The vast differences in the types of aircraft available made producing spare parts incredibly difficult. Another issue was the lack of trained pilots and mechanics. The Bolsheviks were untrusting of many soldiers and pilots and executed many of them due to their paranoia. Indeed, many mechanics and pilots joined the Whites or fled the country altogether. Still, these unnecessary executions limited the effectiveness of the Soviet Air Force. The Soviet Air Force also suffered from a lack of fuel. The oil fields in the Caucasus and Siberia were under the control of the Whites, and foreign countries were largely unwilling to trade oil with the Soviets. In addition, the fuel that was available to the Bolsheviks mostly went to the highly prioritized army, leaving very little left for the Air Force. The Soviets resorted to using a very ineffective mixture of fuel, often combining kerosene rather than petrol. In order to better prepare the Air Force for combat, the Soviets established aviation schools in major cities like Moscow and Petrograd, and trained over 1,000 pilots during the Civil War. Most operations were for recon or liaison. In total, the Soviets dropped about 2.3 metric tons of bombs on the southern front. The Soviet Air Force had a more meaningful contribution to the Red victory on the Siberian front against White leader Alexander Kolchak's all-Russian government. Soviet planes performed reconnaissance, which was of critical importance due to the large combat area and a small number of ground troops involved. In addition, Soviet bombers dropped 4.5 metric tons of bombs in 1919 on the Siberian front. On this front, the city of Kazan was hotly contested by both sides, but the Reds ultimately won. Soviet planes performed around 300 sorties and dropped 1.6 metric tons of bombs on this city alone. By 1919 and 1920, the Soviets controlled most of European Russia. The infrastructure here allowed the Soviets to transfer spare parts to the front and to transport air squadrons around different fronts. On the other hand, the White forces were cut off from each other and typically had poorer infrastructure, especially in Siberia. The Bolshevik forces were surrounded on all sides by enemies. Not only were they fighting other Russians, but also new nations that had emerged in the West, such as Ukraine and Poland. In early 1919, war broke out between Poland and the Soviets. The Poles wanted to reclaim the lands historically inhabited by Poles, but that meant taking land formerly a part of the Russian Empire. The Soviets wanted to reclaim Poland and establish the borders of Imperial Russia. The Soviets used 70% of their inventory of planes against Poland in 1920, which was about 220 planes. They tried to form squadrons with aircraft of identical or similar types in order to organize the supply of spare parts and planes. The Soviets dropped 6.35 metric tons of bombs during this conflict, which was more tonnage dropped by the Reds than on any other front in the Civil War. Due to Poland's sizable inventory of planes, more dogfights occurred in this conflict, and the Soviets endured heavier losses. By 1923, the Bolsheviks had finally grabbed control of all of Russia. Russian industry was battered by both World War I and the Civil War, and Soviet leader Vladimir Lenin worked to revive the economy. He introduced the new economic policy, which allowed industry to become more autonomous, causing the economy to grow at a rapid pace. This allowed the Soviets to develop more aircraft factories. The Soviet Air Force was given more autonomy in 1924, removing it from the influence of military figures who prioritized the army over everything else. In the early 1920s, Russian designers came up with new aircraft models. The first all-metal design was the Tupolev ANT-2, a passenger plane with a top speed of 161 km per hour. The Soviets also imported foreign models. One particular plane was the British de Havilland DH-9A, a light bomber with a top speed of 198 km per hour. About 2,860 were made in the USSR. Soviet warplanes gained more powerful engines over the years. Some examples include the I-2 and the I-4. Most of these domestically designed planes used foreign engine models. One famous Soviet plane from this period was the Polikarpov Po-2, originally designated as the U-2. A biplane with a maximum speed of 137 km per hour, it was generally used in training, recon, and liaison roles. However, despite its age, it saw service in World War II as a night bomber with some success. In the Korean War, the Po-2 destroyed an F-86 Sabre and damaged 86 others while raiding an airbase. It seems peculiar, but in the 1920s, Germany and the USSR collaborated with each other in the development of aircraft and tactics. Germany and Russia had fought against each other in World War I, but the fact of the matter was that their new regimes had emerged in both countries. In 1922, Germany and the Soviet Union signed the Treaty of Rapallo, which normalized friendly relations between the countries. The Weimar Republic and the Soviet Union were bitter about the Treaty of Versailles and disliked the creation of Poland, which now controlled territory that had once belonged to its neighbors. They also began working closely together in the aviation industry. Germany agreed to send a mission to Russia to train Soviet pilots. Germany gained critical experience working with the Soviet Air Force when they were prohibited by the Versailles Treaty from having an air force of their own. The Moscow government was looking for economic assistance in rebuilding the country. The two sides made an agreement in which the German Junkers Company would construct an aircraft factory in Moscow and manufacture parts and planes. Junkers was forced to abandon the factory in 1925 due to economic troubles, but the Soviets inherited the exceptional factory. During the same time frame, the Soviet government started an initiative that educated peasants about aviation technology and tactics, and this prepared them for service during World War II. Still, despite domestically designed aircraft models, the majority of Soviet planes were foreign designs, and Soviet industry lagged behind. Dictator Joseph Stalin, very aware of the USSR's vulnerabilities, initiated an economic program to boost production in 1928, named the First Five-Year Plan. In a remarkably short amount of time, the Soviet steel industry boomed, and factories sprang up across the western part of the country. At the same time, it is important to note the immense loss of life as a result of this ruthless program. The abundant factories allowed the Soviets to build more planes. The emphasis on the aviation industry during the five-year plan is strikingly apparent. In 1929, less than 10% of all Soviet military manpower was in the Air Force. By 1932, the ratio had greatly increased. In addition, the number of skilled workers in aircraft factories increased by over 750%. Before the five-year plan, the rate of production of aircraft engines was incredibly low. By the 1930s, more resources had been invested in expanding engine production, which increased overall plane construction. Peasants, who were forced to learn how to use machines like tractors during the mechanization period of the five-year plan, naturally became prepared to work on aviation technology if needed. In addition, the USSR worked with the United States to boost its aviation industry by producing licensed copies of powerful American engines. By 1940, the USSR produced about 7,000 planes a year. New aircraft introduced in the early 1930s include the Polikarpov R-5, used for recon and light bombing, the Tupolev TB-3 heavy bomber, and the Polikarpov I-5 fighter. Polikarpov became a leader in the aircraft industry after the release of the I-15 and I-16 fighters in 1933. The I-15 would eventually develop into the I-153 in World War II. Both the I-153 and the I-16 had spectacular speed, firepower, and agility. They saw action in the Spanish Civil War on the Republican side, in the Battle of Khalkhin Gol against the Japanese, in the Winter War against Finland, and in World War II. They remained in production until 1941. They also produced a number of bombers, like the PE-8 and TB-3. With these new designs, the Soviets achieved many world records, such as for top speeds, long-distance flying, high-altitude flying, and establishing records for women in aviation. By early 1937, the Soviets had around 2,500 planes, 60% of which were bombers. From their experiences in World War I, the Russians understood the importance of bombers as both a psychological and practical weapon. Some Soviet theorists even argued that a superior bomber fleet could be the determining factor in wars. The Soviets prepared to use their bombers against concentrated industrial targets in Germany and Japan because war with these countries was a present possibility. The Soviets invested in ground support aircraft like the Su-2 for bombing frontline targets. Additionally, the Soviets initiated a paratrooper program in the early 1930s, and they performed well during the military exercises. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky was an instrumental leader in this initiative. He was among the top aviation leaders executed during Stalin's Great Purge of 1937, which limited the effectiveness of the Soviet Aviation Command during wars. The Soviet Air Force under the rule of Stalin had its first military test against China in 1929. The Chinese and Soviet Union disagreed about the extent that the latter had over the Chinese Eastern Railway in Manchuria. Tensions escalated into conflict, and about 150,000 Soviet troops were sent to the east. A number of Soviet aircraft were involved in the fighting and helped the Soviets win. Soviet aircraft saw major action during the Spanish Civil War of 1936 to 1939. Stalin was cautious about sending support to the Republican faction, for he did not want to alarm Britain and France, who he saw as potential allies against a militarized Nazi Germany. On the other hand, he did not want to look weak in international eyes. The Soviets sent around 1,500 aircraft in total and hundreds of pilots and mechanics to support the Spanish communists. No more than 500 planes were operational at any one time, though. Around 500 I-15 biplanes were sent and 500 I-16s, 200 SB-2 bombers, and around 300 obsolete R-5s were sent. On the contrary, Germany sent the iconic Condor Legion to help Franco's nationalist forces, and the German Bf-109s were undoubtedly a superior plane to any of the ones sent by the USSR. The USSR's experiences in Spain proved to them that they needed more modern equipment and to update their tactics. This is what led them to make new planes with 12.7mm machine guns rather than 7.7mm machine guns. The Soviets invested heavily in attempts to limit Japanese expansion in Asia. When Japan invaded China in the summer of 1937, the Soviets quickly reacted. By 1939, the USSR had sent over 1,000 planes and 2,000 pilots to China, and this quickly hampered Japanese foes. Each pilot served for 6 months and was cycled out, and this gave them excellent combat experience. Soviet I-16s had a much easier time against the less sophisticated Japanese Air Force. In 1938, a clash between Soviet and Japanese units occurred near Lake Khasan on the North Korean-Soviet border. The Soviets were victorious, but they concluded that they needed to send more troops to East Asia to fend off another potential conflict with Japan. By the time the two sides clashed again at Khalkhin Gol in 1939 over a Mongolian border dispute, the Soviets were ready. With over 60,000 soldiers and 500 aircraft, the Soviets were more than ready to take on Japanese force, with only 1/3 of the troops and equipment. The Soviets won with the help of recon and bombing aircraft, but lost 250 planes compared to 220 Japanese losses. By 1940, the Soviets stopped sending pilots to China. Not only were there now enough trained Chinese pilots, but the Soviets needed to divert resources to their war against Finland, called the Winter War. But the 1941 Soviet-Japanese Non-Aggression Pact gave the Soviets a sigh of relief in Asia. They no longer had to worry about possible Japanese attacks and could now focus on larger threats in Europe. The Soviet Air Force began as a miserable jumble of planes when it was first established in 1917, and it was plagued by a lack of industry. Lenin and Stalin's economic programs of the 1920s and 30s greatly expanded Soviet industry, allowing more aircraft to be produced. These initiatives would help the Soviets win battles against the Japanese in Asia, but failed to turn the tide of the Spanish Civil War. The Soviets would face more challenges when they entered World War II in 1941.